Mr. Issa's line and that of his lieutenants he has with him. He also has the head of HR and the people officer there, I guess, to try and show a united front and impress MPs a little more than he managed last time. But the picture has been that this is a sustainable business. Despite the concerns over that level of leverage, they are intent on bringing that down. There was an admission that some of the debt loaded onto the company will come due in February and that the interest rates on that are likely to rise to a floating rate. That's going to add around £30 million to the cost of servicing that debt. So we're getting a little bit of light shed, but I suspect it is possible that Mr. Issa, having adopted this company structure, loaded a big four supermarket with debt, is never going to satisfy some of the MPs on this committee. What they want to hear is that a company that ultimately is a crucial part of the UK's food supply is sustainable and stable.
OK, Paul, thanks for that. Some other business news stories for you now. And the fashion retailer Superdry has lost more than a quarter of its stock market value this morning after warning that profits for the year will be lower than expected. Shares of Superdry fell by as much as 28% at one point after it said that during the 26 weeks to the 28th of October, its retail sales were down 13.1% on the same period last year, while its wholesale sales were down by 41.1%. Superdry blamed a challenging consumer retail market and abnormally mild autumn weather, which resulted in a delayed uptake of its autumn and winter collection. The banknote and passport producer De La Rue said this morning it was starting to see a recovery in demand following the downturn in the use of cash during the pandemic. The company, which produces banknotes for more than half the issuing authorities around the world, said it had won substantial multi-year banknote orders this year in Africa, the Middle East and in Asia, while highlights in its authentication division included strong sales for the new R-Series Australian passport. Half-year pre-tax losses widened from £15.9 million to £16.8 million, due largely to one-off costs. The shares are off by some 6% currently. And further questions were raised this morning over the health of Hypnosis Songs Fund, the investment trust that specialises in buying the rights to songs by artists from Ed Sheeran to Blondie, after it delayed the publication of the results for its 6 months to the end of September. Hypnosis said the delay was due to a dispute over the valuation of the company's assets in its results. It said the valuation the company had received from its independent valuer was materially higher than the valuation implied by proposed and recent transactions in the sector. It promises to have the results out by the end of the year. Hypnosis shares have fallen by some 3.5% on that news. Now, carbon removal, the process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it safely for decades or even centuries, is seen as a key way of hitting climate targets set out in the Paris Agreement. But it's a market that remains short of finance. To that end, British Airways and Standard Chartered have teamed up with Undo, a project developer, and Curate, which has built a platform to support the carbon removal market with a view to unlocking more capital. Well, joining me now is Carrie Harris, Director of Sustainability at British Airways. And with me in the studio is Marta Krupinska, Chief Executive and Co-founder of Curate. Welcome to you both. Marta, let me start with you. How does this scheme work?
Thanks so much, Ian. Thanks for having us. So, as we heard, carbon removal is short of financing. We need between $6 and $16 trillion by 2050, according to the latest McKinsey report, to build out this really critical industry. Today, a lot of the buyers of carbon removal, in order to lock in supply, need to pay up front, because then the project suppliers need to spend that money to do all the things that lead to carbon sequestration. What we're trying to achieve with this scheme is to partner with big buyers and financing partners to show that we can provide capital not up front from the buyer, so the buyer still gets benefit of access to high-quality carbon removal supply over the longer period of time. That money is given to the project developer so they don't have a working capital gap, which would be crippling for any organization that is working on this critical technology, and the capital can come from a third party that's providing the financing. We're really hoping that by doing this, we can stimulate more demand that's critically needed.
That makes sense. So, before we turn to British Airways, how did Standard Chartered get involved?
Actually, the power of partnerships. We were introduced to Standard Chartered by Carrie herself, which shows that really building close relationships with people you work with can massively pay off.
OK, well, Carrie, let me bring you in here. What made British Airways want to get involved?
So for us, sustainability is a critical part of our business strategy, and tackling the impact that our flying has on the climate is a fundamental part of that. carbon removals will form approximately a third of our pathway to achieving net zero. And that's true globally for action. You know, the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the UK Committee for Climate Change have all recognised carbon removals will form up to 1/3 of global action to achieve net zero. So it's vital for our strategy. And at the moment, there's simply not enough of them. And so we really saw an opportunity with this partnership to showcase what's possible by starting small and hopefully scaling much larger to bring this solution to scale.
And how much are you spending on this initial pilot?
So this initial pilot, we have purchased 4,000 tonnes of carbon removals, and we'll take that over the next 5 years. It's a small start, but as we say, this is a demonstration project to show all the elements of the supply chain are ready and in place. It's innovative, as Marta just said, in showing the debt financing opportunity. It's innovative as in showcasing a UK carbon removal solution that Undo are operating with enhanced rock weathering. And we hope it's just going to capture people's imaginations and draw attention to carbon removals as a great opportunity to help tackle climate impact.
4,000 tonnes of carbon sounds an awful lot, but put that into proportion in terms of BA's total carbon footprint per year.
Yeah, so it's a small part now of our total carbon footprint. You know, our carbon footprint now is around 14 to 15 million tonnes of CO2. We're not shying away from that. We're absolutely leaning into it, and we've got an extensive programme of action to address that, from the aircraft that we operate to investing already $865 million in sustainable aviation fuel to achieve 10% by 2030. We're proactively invested in hydrogen propulsion, and this is the final part of our pathway to net zero, is carbon removals, another vital element.
Carrie, how will the carbon removal that you're supporting here in this project, how is it affected? What happens?
So this is what's called enhanced weathering. And I should say there's many different types of carbon removal solutions, ranging from nature-based like tree planting to mangroves to technology-based direct air capture, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. This one sits someplace in the middle. It's kind of a natural biological process of rock weathering. But Undo basically use waste product from basalt rock quarrying. They crush it down into a fine dust, and it's then spread on farmland. So it supports soil health, it acts as a soil fertilizer. But because it's crushed down, it has a high surface area, which means that when rainfall interacts with it, it's locking carbon into the soil for hundreds of years. So it's quite a simple technique. And that's what's really exciting about it. It can be scaled significantly in the UK, and Undo themselves believe this could be mitigating about 30 million tonnes of CO2 in the UK alone.
Marta, it's obviously very exciting that BA have got involved in this project. How are you going to get others involved, particularly in the construction and building materials sector, which are obviously big carbon emitters?
100%. I mean, I'd say the UK is a fantastic place to be building a carbon removals industry. We are the first country to have a legal definition of net zero, which says you need to reduce your emissions by 90% in line with SBTI, the standard science-based target initiative, and then durably remove the remaining 10. We are incredibly excited about the dawn of compliance. We know the traditional compliance markets talk about trading between countries. In this case, we're talking about the voluntary carbon removals market becoming included in the compliance market, at which point it's not going to just be us partnering with really innovative organizations that care, such as BA, that want to start investing today, but actually organizations that will want to start small and start today, but in a couple of years, up to 5 years, will actually be mandated to do it, to keep their license to operate.
So basically, this is a case of build it and they will come.
Well, that's our hope. The one thing that we do need to emphasize is that we can't really wait for them to come. This is why we call ourselves a market maker at Curate. We work with suppliers and buyers today, because we know that in order to get to 10 billion tons of carbon removal by 2050, we need to get to at least 1 billion by 2030. We don't really have very much time, which is why all these innovative partnerships like this one are supposed to make the market much faster and much quicker.
Now, I believe your backers include Google Ventures. Presumably that will help open a few doors in future as well.
Well, indeed, we have a great relationship with Google. Large organizations like Google have been investing in carbon removal for a while now. There's a fund called Frontier Fund that has committed $1.2 billion trillion into carbon removal purchases. That sounds like a lot. Yet again, going back to we need between $6 and $1.6 trillion. We really need to be starting now and starting fast. And I'm really excited about organizations like BA that come from the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. Big tech or consulting firms have a relatively small footprint in relation to the amount of money that they make. Organizations that are, as you said earlier, heavy emitters are going to have to work this much harder to include carbon removal into their business model to remain viable businesses, as well as do the right thing for the environment. So actually figuring out new business models that can be baked into the operations of these businesses, that's something that we at Curate are trying to help organizations with.
Very good, Marta. Nice to see you again. We had you on the programme in May last year, I believe.
Indeed, thanks so much.
Thanks for joining me. Carrie, great to see you too. Thanks very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Well, after last night's gains on Wall Street, during which the S&P 500 extended its longest winning streak in 6 years, equities saw mixed trading overnight in the Asia-Pacific region. The highlight was undoubtedly the Nikkei 225 in Tokyo, which rose by nearly 1.5% after the Bank of Japan, after plenty of hints to the contrary, stuck to its ultra-loose monetary policy. Well, in Europe this morning, stocks are pretty much in positive territory right now, though if you look at the MIB in Milan, it's more or less unchanged. Likewise, the CAC 40 in Paris. That was after one of the European Central Bank's rate setters said interest rates would fall in the Eurozone next year. Talking points this morning include Casino. The debt-laden French supermarket is off 7%, returning from suspension after agreeing to sell all of its big stores ahead of a financial restructuring. Well, here in London, the FTSE 100 is pretty flattish this morning. Gains for the mining heavyweights being balanced out by losses elsewhere. In terms of percentage gainers, well, Entain, the gaming company, is again among leading FTSE gainers. That's following last week's boardroom shake-up. I think Entain currently up about 2% right now. Also ahead today, if you were watching yesterday, I mentioned this a couple of times, Fresnillo, the Mexican silver mine, it sold off by 8% yesterday. It's rallied by just over 1.5% this morning. Outside the FTSE 100, the mobile infrastructure group Helios Towers is ahead by some 3.25%. That's on the back of supportive broker comment, while the infection prevention products developer Tristel is ahead by some 7.5%. That's after its half-year results came in better than expected. On the foreign exchange markets, well, the pound has had a good session so far today, ahead of tomorrow's inflation data. Basically, the market betting that the Bank of England will be slower than the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank in cutting interest rates next year. Sterling ahead by 0.5% right now against the dollar, by 0.2% against the euro. After yesterday's rise on the back of concerns over disruption to supplies being transported through the Red Sea, the oil price has eased this morning very, very slightly. A barrel of Brent crude will currently set you back $77.88 a barrel. That's down 0.1%. Well, joining me this morning is James Bolter, Senior Investment Director at Investec Wealth and Investment. James, good to see you this morning. What a rally we have had in November and December. Is there still a bit more in the tank before the end of the year?
Well, it's worth reflecting, Ian, that it is an extraordinary rally. We're up on the S&P 500, the key American benchmark, by about 15% since the end of October. And this is in sympathy with the bond market. We, in a bit of financial jargon, cross-asset correlation between the bond markets and the equity markets. And it's what's happening in the bond markets, those expectations about interest rates, in fact, that is driving this rally, I think. But the scale of it, as you say, is extraordinary. If you take the Nasdaq 100, which is a concentrated index, tends to be quite tech-heavy in the US, that is looking like it might achieve its best year since 1999, up over 50%. So extraordinary rally and a lot of it concentrated in the fourth quarter.
It really is. You mentioned the bond market, though. I mean, it's been a good time to be invested in Eurozone sovereign debt in particular. Is that going to be upset by the inflation data we get out of the Eurozone, do you think?
It might be. The reading today is a final reading. I suspect that what really matters is the battle between markets and central bankers. You're getting the central bankers really pushing back against the market narrative at the moment. Christine Lagarde, last week, president of the ECB, of course, saying we didn't even talk about rate cuts. And yet you have the market pricing in pretty aggressive rate cuts for 2024. So I think what's going to matter is that battle between the markets and the central bankers. I have to say the history of that is that the markets sometimes win. And it reminds me a little bit of the period in 2020 and 2021, where we had, if you like, the reverse situation. Jerome Powell in the US back in the middle of 2020 saying, look, we're not even thinking about raising interest rates. And of course, some people in the market were thinking about that. Yes. And I think we have the reverse situation now.
You reminded me further back when Alan Greenspan talked about irrational exuberance. And of course, the markets just became even more irrational and exuberant. Quick word on London. I mean, the UK is really, really underperformed in equities this year compared with its international peers. Any chances of that changing next year?
It has, I'm afraid, and it marks a 9th year out of the prior 10 where the London market has underperformed the wider global stock market. That's perhaps not as remarkable as it sounds, because it's really about the dominance of the US. It looks as though the US is about to become 70% of developed market equity capitalisation, which is an extraordinary amount of dominance. So it's not necessarily a problem with the London market so much as it's about the dominance of the US. There's a bit of an irony in the sense that although the UK economy is struggling on multiple fronts, and we talk about that a lot, that's not necessarily particularly bad for the London stock market, partly the currency, because the market has an inverse relationship with the strength of sterling, but also because of the composition of the London stock market and the companies that are big here.
Very good. James, got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Good to see you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Still to come here on Business Live, why female founders are still only receiving a fraction of the funds made available by venture capital. Don't go away.
Slide Emirates. Slide better. Fly Emirates. Fly better.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Now, female founders are still only receiving a fraction of the funds made available by venture capital firms, according to a report just published. The 5th annual funding report, published by the early-stage VC firm Unconventional Ventures, reveals that all female founding teams received just 1.9% of available capital in the UK, 1.7% in Germany, 1% in the Nordics, and a mere 0.6% in France. Meanwhile, female founding teams on average receive less capital per funding round than their male equivalents in most European countries. Well, joining me now is Nora Bavey, co-founder and general partner at Unconventional Ventures. Nora, welcome to you. This is something that we've discussed on this programme an awful lot over the years. Why does nothing appear to be changing?
Has been around 1%. Obviously, some markets doing a little bit better, but it's still not enough. And I think we're at a very critical point in time in venture capital industry where we need to acknowledge that it's not the entrepreneurs and it's not them learning how to become better entrepreneurs or being better at receiving funding or asking for funding. It's really about investors having the power to shift and making better business decisions. And those are not simply being made. And obviously, there's a lot of questions in terms of, are we still biases towards a certain percentage of the founder community? And I would say yes. Over and over again, we are still sticking with our biases when it comes to who receives funding and what kind of solution and businesses are we supporting.
Obviously, it's been a pretty tough year for VC funding. There has been a scarcity of capital around. Could it be that these biases to which you refer are just a case of VC investors being fairly conservative because of the uncertain environment?
Well, I think when it comes to the uncertainties that we've seen that affected everyone, obviously affects women and people of color even more so. So I think we need to be honest in terms of what did it look like to begin with. And we can see that when funding was much more accessible and we had some really, record-breaking years in terms of capital deployed into startups, we've seen that the numbers haven't budged that much. I think in a very good market, we've only seen around 2 or 3% being towards female founders as an example. And that's with the ecosystem being consisting over 26% of women in the startup ecosystem. So I think the problem still stays the same. It just keeps on getting worse when we look at market conditions. And I think what we've seen in terms of progress is really just in California, where we have the California state bill recently this fall signing and urging, the government is urging now VC funds when they are getting funded by the government that they now need to report on diversity data. And that is what we now, after 5 years doing this report, is urging the ecosystem in Europe to do as well.
One thing I thought was quite interesting is that although in most European countries the amount raised per funding round by all female teams was less than their male equivalents, in the UK it's more or less the same. Why the difference, do you think?
Well, I think the UK has always been much more open about the conversation. Obviously, you do have diversity data. Most US markets do not have that. Obviously, you do look beyond gender. You also have ethnicity, and you look at different kind of communities. Most of Europe does not do that. And I think it goes back to when we know the numbers, we need to perform better. And this is even in a market that is consistently proving over again that the best innovation and the best business decisions comes from mixed teams, comes when women are more represented, when people of color are more represented. And obviously, when you have that transparency in data, you act on it. And I think that is one thing that is left. Now, UK obviously can do much better and should, but I think you've been kind of leading the way because of that.
OK, Nora, good to talk to you this morning. We have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Great talking to you, Ian. Thank you.
That's it from me. I'm back again at 4:30 this afternoon with our afternoon edition. Hope to see you then. Do stay tuned after this short break. Jane Secker is back next. See you.